The morning sun cast long shadows across Stanford University's prestigious campus as Sundar Pichai hurried toward the mathematics building. It was his third week as a graduate student, and he was still trying to navigate the complex maze of American higher education. Back home in India, at IIT Kharagpur, Sundar had been a star student, graduating with honors in metallurgical engineering. But here at Stanford, he felt like just another face in the crowd. Clutching his worn calculus textbook to his chest, Sundar pushed open the heavy wooden door to Lecture Hall B. Professor Richard Harrison's advanced calculus class was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes, and Sundar preferred to arrive early. He slipped into a seat in the back row, pulled out his notebook, and began reviewing his notes from the previous session. Professor Harrison was known throughout the department for two things: his brilliant mathematical mind and his harsh treatment of students he deemed unworthy of his time. International students, especially those from Asia, often received the brunt of his criticism. Many whispered that the aging professor held outdated views about who belonged in elite American universities. He made Jung Ho cry last semester. A student had warned Sundar during orientation week. Asked him to solve a problem, then mocked his accent when he tried to explain his approach. The lecture hall filled quickly as students filed in, their faces showing a mixture of determination and dread. At exactly 9 a.m., Professor Harrison strode into the room. Tall and lean with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his own intelligence. "Good morning," he announced without warmth, placing his leather briefcase on the desk. "Today we'll be discussing multivariate calculus and its applications in engineering. But first, let's see if any of you bothered to complete the reading assignment." Sundar sat up straighter. He had not only completed the assigned reading but had gone through 3 additional papers referenced in the footnotes. Mathematics had always been his refuge, a universal language that transcended cultural barriers. While his English still carried a noticeable accent, numbers spoke to him with perfect clarity. Professor Harrison's eyes scanned the room, looking for a victim. "I need someone to explain Lagrangian multipliers and their practical applications." His gaze settled on a nervous-looking Chinese student in the front row, who fumbled through an explanation before Harrison cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Barely adequate," the professor remarked. "Let's try someone else." For the next 30 minutes, Harrison called on student after student, finding fault with each answer. The tension in the room grew palpable. Sundar kept his eyes down, hoping to avoid attention, but also mentally answering each question with precision. As the lecture continued, Harrison wrote a complex equation on the board. "This," he announced with a hint of satisfaction, "is something most of you will struggle with. It relates to optimization problems in multiple dimensions." Sundar recognized it immediately. During his undergraduate studies, he had specialized in similar problems while participating in mathematics competitions. The solution approached him like an old friend, clear and elegant. Harrison turned to face the class, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Sundar in the back row. "You there," he called out. "The Indian student. You've been awfully quiet." Every head in the lecture hall turned toward Sundar. He felt his heart rate quicken, but kept his expression calm. "Since you seem so comfortable hiding in the back," Harrison continued with a slight smirk, "perhaps you'd like to tell us how to approach this problem." Little did Professor Harrison know that he had just challenged one of the most naturally gifted mathematical minds of the generation, a young man whose analytical abilities would one day help him lead one of the world's most innovative companies. Sundar stood up slowly, gathering his thoughts. The journey that would forever change the dynamic between the arrogant professor and the humble student had just begun. All eyes in the lecture hall focused on Sundar as he made his way down the row of seats toward the front of the classroom. Each step felt longer than it should, the silence growing heavier with every passing second. Professor Harrison stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed and a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. He clearly expected this to be another opportunity to establish his dominance. "Take your time," Harrison said, his voice dripping with mock patience. "We have all day to wait for your answer." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had seen this routine before, the professor building someone up for a public fall. What made it worse was that Sundar was well liked among his peers. In the short time since the semester began, he had helped several classmates understand difficult concepts, never showing a hint of arrogance despite his clear talent. Sundar reached the front of the classroom and stood before the equation. It was a multivariable optimization problem with several constraints, the kind that required both creative thinking and technical precision. He studied it for a moment, his mind working through possible approaches. "Perhaps I should simplify it for you," Professor Harrison offered, reaching for the eraser. "That won't be necessary, sir," Sundar replied quietly. His voice was soft but steady, carrying just enough confidence to make Harrison pause. Sundar picked up a piece of chalk and began writing on the board next to the original equation. His handwriting was neat and methodical, each symbol placed with care. The class watched in silence as he worked through the problem step by step, not rushing but moving with purpose. Professor Harrison's smirk gradually faded as he observed Sundar's approach. The young student wasn't just solving the problem. He was using an elegant method that Harrison himself had only read about in recent mathematical journals. It was an approach that simplified the complexity through a clever substitution that few graduate students would even consider. "This is interesting," Sundar explained as he wrote, his accent noticeable but his explanation crystal clear. "If we look at the problem from this angle, we can transform the constraints into a simpler form." For nearly 10 minutes, Sundar continued his work, occasionally pausing to double-check his calculations. The students watched with growing amazement as the solution unfolded on the board. Even those who couldn't follow all the steps could sense that something unusual was happening. When Sundar finally placed the chalk down and stepped back from his completed work, the silence in the room had transformed from tense to awed. Professor Harrison stared at the board, his eyes moving back and forth across Sundar's solution. He was looking for errors, for any weakness he could exploit. Finding none, his face reddened slightly. "This is," Harrison began, then cleared his throat. "This is correct. The approach is unconventional, but effective." It was as close to praise as the professor had given any student all semester. Sundar nodded politely. "Thank you, sir. We use similar techniques for engineering optimization at IIT." "IIT?" Harrison asked, a hint of recognition in his voice. "Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur," Sundar clarified. "I studied metallurgical engineering there." A murmur ran through the class. IIT's reputation was well known in academic circles. Its entrance exam was considered one of the most difficult in the world, with acceptance rates lower than Harvard or MIT. "I see," Harrison said, his tone noticeably different. "Well, Mr. Pichai," Sundar supplied. "Sundar Pichai." "Mr. Pichai, thank you for that demonstration. You may return to your seat." As Sundar walked back to his place, several students nodded at him with new respect. A few even offered small smiles of appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Not just a brilliant solution, but a humble display of knowledge that had momentarily humbled their intimidating professor. Professor Harrison turned back to the board, erased Sundar's work, and continued the lecture. But something had shifted in the classroom dynamic. For the first time, Harrison seemed slightly less confident, occasionally glancing toward the back of the room where Sundar sat, quietly taking notes. The professor had just discovered that appearances could be deceiving, and that brilliance often came in unexpected packages. This would not be their last encounter. The following week brought dreary weather to Stanford's campus. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning walkways into small rivers and fogging the windows of the mathematics building. Students hurried inside, shaking water from their umbrellas and jackets as they filed into Professor Harrison's classroom. "Today," Harrison announced, "we will discuss applications of vector calculus in physical systems. Before we start, I'd like to try something different." He pulled out a stack of papers. "I prepared a pop quiz to assess your understanding of our previous material." Groans filled the room. Pop quizzes were rare in graduate-level courses, and they smelled of punishment rather than education. "This isn't your ordinary quiz," Harrison continued. "I've included 3 problems of increasing difficulty. The first is straightforward. The second is challenging. The third," he paused for effect, "is a problem that appeared in last year's International Mathematical Olympiad. Only 6 students worldwide solved it correctly during the competition." Whispers spread through the classroom. The IMO was known for its brutally difficult problems that required creative thinking beyond standard mathematical approaches. "You have 30 minutes, Harrison said, passing the papers to the front row to distribute. Begin now. Sundar received his copy and scanned the three problems quickly. The first was indeed simple, a basic optimization question. The second required careful application of techniques they had covered in class. But the third problem made him sit up straighter. It was elegant in its complexity, the kind of puzzle that would keep most mathematicians awake at night. He started working immediately, solving the first two problems with methodical precision before turning his full attention to the IMO challenge. As he worked, memories from his high school days flooded back, the countless hours spent preparing for mathematics competitions, the joy of finding unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated concepts. 20 minutes into the quiz, Sundar raised his hand. Professor Harrison, who had been pacing between the rows of desks, looked surprised. "Do you have a question, Mr. Pichai?" he asked. "No, sir," Sundar replied. "I finished." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "All three problems?" "Yes, sir." The professor approached and took Sundar's paper, skepticism clear on his face. The other students watched with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief as Harrison reviewed Sundar's solutions right there, standing next to his desk. Harrison's expression changed gradually as he read through each answer, from doubt to surprise to what almost looked like respect. When he reached the IMO problem, he spent several minutes checking Sundar's work, occasionally nodding to himself. "Mr. Pichai," Harrison finally said, his voice loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Your solutions to the first two problems are correct, as I expected they might be." He paused, and the classroom held its collective breath. "As for the Olympiad problem, your approach is not the standard solution. In fact, it's more elegant than the one provided in the judge's answer key. You found a shorter path to the answer that I hadn't considered." Murmurs rippled through the classroom. Professor Harrison, famous for never praising students, had just given Sundar what amounted to high acclaim. "The rest of you," Harrison addressed the class, "have 10 more minutes to finish your work." As Harrison returned to the front of the room, Sundar noticed several students looking at him with new expressions, some impressed, others envious, a few plainly intimidated. He hadn't sought attention, but now found himself unavoidably in the spotlight. After class, as students filed out into the still pouring rain, Professor Harrison called out, "Mr. Pichai, a moment of your time, please." Sundar approached the professor's desk, unsure what to expect. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Harrison asked, his voice quieter than usual. "That's not standard curriculum anywhere." "I participated in math competitions throughout school, sir," Sundar replied. "When you solve enough puzzles, you start to see patterns that others might miss." Harrison nodded slowly. "I've been teaching for 30 years, Mr. Pichai. It's rare to find a student with your level of insight." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "I would welcome your participation in class discussions more often." Coming from Harrison, it was practically an invitation to co-teach the course. "Thank you, sir," Sundar said simply. "I'd be happy to contribute." Neither knew it then, but this exchange marked the beginning of a transformation in their relationship, one that would eventually lead to mutual respect between the proud professor and the gifted student. News of Sundar's mathematical prowess spread quickly through the engineering department. Students began saving seats for him in the library study areas, hoping he might help with particularly difficult problems. Teaching assistants from other courses would nod respectfully when passing him in hallways. Even professors in related fields had started to hear whispers about the brilliant Indian student who had impressed the notoriously difficult Professor Harrison. For Sundar, the attention was uncomfortable. He had never sought the spotlight, preferring instead to let his work speak for itself. Back in India, his family had raised him with simple values: work hard, stay humble, help others when you can. The growing recognition felt at odds with these principles. Dr. Chen's presentation focused on applications of advanced calculus in machine learning algorithms, a field that fascinated Sundar. As she explained complex concepts with remarkable clarity, Sundar took detailed notes, his mind racing with connections to his own academic interests. "Before I conclude," Dr. Chen said near the end of her talk, "I'd like to present a problem my research team has been struggling with. We're developing a more efficient algorithm for natural language processing, but we've hit a mathematical roadblock." She wrote a complex equation on the board, explaining the constraints and variables involved. If any of you have insights, I welcome them. This has stumped some brilliant minds at MIT for months now. The room fell silent as students studied the problem. It involved optimization across multiple dimensions with seemingly contradictory constraints, exactly the kind of puzzle that Sundar found most intriguing. His hand instinctively moved to raise itself, but he hesitated, not wanting to draw more attention. Mr. Pichai, Professor Harrison's voice broke the silence. You look like you might have something to contribute. All eyes turned to Sundar. Even Dr. Chen looked at him with curious interest. Taking a deep breath, Sundar stood up. I think there might be an approach using a modified version of Lagrangian multipliers combined with tensor decomposition. Please, elaborate. Dr. Chen encouraged, offering him the marker. For the next 15 minutes, Sundar worked through his proposed solution on the board. He began tentatively, but gained confidence as the approach unfolded logically. The room watched in absolute silence, with only the occasional whisper between students trying to follow his reasoning. Dr. Chen stood beside him, nodding occasionally, her expression growing increasingly animated. When Sundar finally placed the cap back on the marker, she broke into a wide smile. This is remarkable, she said, studying the equations. You've reframed the problem in a way we never considered. She turned to face the class. What Mr. Pichai has done here is create a bridge between two mathematical approaches that are usually considered separate domains. It's exactly the kind of creative thinking we need more of in applied mathematics. Professor Harrison, standing at the back of the room, nodded in agreement, a gesture not lost on the students who had known him long enough to understand its significance. After the lecture, Dr. Chen approached Sundar as students filed out of the hall. Professor Harrison tells me you're in the master's program here? Yes, ma'am, Sundar replied politely. Have you considered pursuing a PhD? With your mathematical intuition, you could make significant contributions to the field. Sundar smiled thoughtfully. I'm actually more interested in applying these concepts to practical problems in technology. I believe mathematics is most beautiful when it helps solve real-world challenges. Dr. Chen looked surprised but impressed. That's refreshing to hear. Too often we get lost in theoretical elegance without considering applications. She handed him her business card. If you ever change your mind about further studies, or if you want to collaborate on research, please contact me. As Sundar tucked the card into his pocket, he noticed Professor Harrison watching from across the room. The professor gave him a small nod, a simple gesture that somehow felt more meaningful than all the attention he had received in recent weeks. Walking back to his dormitory that evening, Sundar reflected on how quickly things had changed. Just a month ago, he had been an anonymous face in a crowded lecture hall. Now, he had earned the respect of one of the department's most demanding professors and caught the attention of a visiting scholar from MIT. Yet his thoughts weren't on accolades or recognition, but on the fascinating problem Dr. Chen had presented and the countless other puzzles waiting to be solved. For Sundar, mathematics had never been about proving his intelligence. It was about the pure joy of discovery. The morning of the exam, Sundar arrived at the lecture hall 20 minutes early. He found several classmates already there, frantically reviewing notes and quizzing each other on formulas. Unlike his peers, Sundar appeared calm. He had prepared thoroughly but wasn't anxious about the outcome. To him, mathematics was not about memorization but understanding core principles and applying them creatively. Aren't you nervous? Asked Lin, a fellow student who had befriended Sundar during a group project. Sundar smiled gently. I find that anxiety rarely improves performance. The mathematics either makes sense or it doesn't. Professor Harrison entered the room exactly at the scheduled time, carrying a stack of exam booklets. His face revealed nothing as he distributed the tests face down on each desk. You got 3 hours, he announced. This exam has 5 questions of increasing difficulty. Show all your work clearly. You may begin. The sound of papers flipping over filled the room, followed by a collective intake of breath. The first page contained a problem so complex that many students had to read it multiple times to understand what was being asked. Sundar scanned all 5 questions before starting. The final problem seemed particularly interesting. It involved optimizing a multivariable function with unusual boundary conditions. He decided to begin with this one, knowing that many students would run out of time before even attempting it. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew palpable. Some students were frantically writing, others staring hopelessly at blank pages. A few had given up on certain problems entirely. Sundar worked steadily through each question, his pencil moving purposefully across the paper. With 30 minutes remaining, he had completed all 5 problems and was carefully checking his work. He noticed a small error in his third solution and meticulously corrected it. When he finally handed in his exam booklet, he was among the first to finish. "Confident, Mr. Pichai?" Professor Harrison asked quietly as he accepted Sundar's exam. "I believe I understood the problems, sir," Sundar replied modestly. Harrison nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll see." 3 days later, students gathered anxiously outside Harrison's office where the graded exams would be returned. The professor's assistant emerged with a list of student ID numbers and corresponding scores written on the department bulletin board. No names were used, just numbers and percentages. As the scores were posted, disappointed groans echoed through the hallway. The highest visible score was 83%, achieved by only one student. Most hovered between 50% and 70%. "Where's your ID number?" Lynn asked Sundar as they scanned the list together. Sundar checked the entire board but couldn't find his number. "It seems to be missing." At that moment, Professor Harrison's office door opened. "Mr. Pichai," he called out. "A word, please." A worried murmur spread through the waiting students. Being called into Harrison's office was rarely a positive experience. Sundar entered cautiously. The professor sat behind his desk, Sundar's exam booklet in front of him. "Close the door," Harrison instructed. When Sundar complied, the professor continued. "I've been teaching advanced calculus for nearly 3 decades, Mr. Pichai." Sundar waited silently, unsure where this was heading. "In all that time," Harrison said, picking up the exam booklet, "I have never awarded a perfect score. Until now." He handed the exam to Sundar. At the top of the page, written in red ink, was 100%, with a single word beneath it. "Extraordinary." "Your solution to the 5th problem was particularly impressive," Harrison continued. "You found an approach I hadn't considered, more elegant than my own solution." Sundar accepted the booklet with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, sir." "I didn't post your score with the others," Harrison explained, "because I wanted to ask you something privately." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Would you consider working as my research assistant next semester? I'm studying applications of multivariable calculus in computer algorithms, and your insights could be valuable." The offer stunned Sundar. Professor Harrison rarely invited students to join his research team, and never first-year graduate students. "I would be honored, Professor," Sundar replied sincerely. As he left the office, Sundar realized how far he had come from that first confrontational day in class. The professor who had tried to humiliate him now sought his collaboration. The journey had been about more than mathematics. It was about proving one's worth through quiet excellence rather than proud declarations. Spring arrived at Stanford, bringing with it cherry blossoms and warmer days. Students shed their winter coats and studied on the grassy quads, enjoying the California sunshine. For Sundar, however, most days were spent in Professor Harrison's research lab, where he had become an integral part of the team. "Sundar, what do you think about this approach?" Professor Harrison asked one afternoon, pointing to a series of equations he had just written. They were working on optimizing algorithms for large-scale data processing, an area that was still emerging in academic circles but showed tremendous promise for real-world applications. 4 other graduate students looked up from their work, waiting for Sundar's response. In the months since joining the team, his insights had proven invaluable, often providing breakthrough perspectives when the research seemed stalled. Sundar studied the equations carefully. "The approach is sound," he began, "but I wonder if we're making an unnecessary assumption here." He picked up a marker and made a small adjustment to one of the formulas. "If we remove this constraint, the solution space expands significantly." Harrison considered the modification, mentally working through its implications. "That's quite clever. It would make the algorithm more flexible for different types of data." One of the other research assistants, David, nodded in agreement. "We could potentially apply this to natural language processing as well, not just numerical data." What had begun as a reluctant respect between Sundar and Professor Harrison had evolved into a productive partnership. The professor had gradually shed his harsh demeanor, at least within the confines of the research lab. He still maintained his reputation for being demanding, but students now noticed something different in his teaching, a new willingness to consider unconventional approaches. As the semester progressed, news arrived that a major technology conference was accepting research papers for presentation. The most promising papers would be published in a prestigious journal. "We should submit our work," Harrison announced to the team. "The deadline is in 3 weeks. I believe our approach offers something genuinely new to the field." The team worked tirelessly, refining their mathematical models and running countless simulations to validate their findings. Sundar often stayed latest, working well into the night to perfect certain aspects of the paper. "You don't need to carry so much of the burden," Professor Harrison told him one evening, finding Sundar alone in the lab at 11 p.m. "I enjoy the work," Sundar replied honestly, "especially seeing how these abstract concepts might someday help people interact with computers more naturally." Harrison studied his star student with curiosity. "Most mathematicians I know are primarily interested in the elegance of the solutions, not their practical applications." "That's where I differ, I suppose," Sundar explained. "I've always believed that mathematics is most beautiful when it serves a purpose beyond itself." This philosophy resonated with Harrison more than he expected. Throughout his career, he had focused on theoretical purity, sometimes dismissing applied mathematics as somehow less intellectually rigorous. Sundar's perspective was changing that view. The day before the submission deadline, the entire team gathered to review the final paper. Each section had been meticulously crafted, with Sundar's contributions forming the theoretical foundation of their approach. "I've made a decision," Harrison announced after they had approved the final draft. "The authorship will be listed alphabetically, with one exception." He looked directly at Sundar. "Mr. Pichai will be listed as second author, after myself." This was an extraordinary honor for a master's student. Typically, professor names came first, followed by senior researchers and doctoral candidates. Being named second author would significantly enhance Sundar's academic reputation. "That's not necessary, Professor," Sundar said, genuinely surprised. "It absolutely is," Harrison insisted. "This paper would not exist in its current form without your insights. Credit should go where it's deserved." The other team members nodded in agreement. There was no jealousy. They had all witnessed Sundar's contributions and understood the recognition was well earned. 2 weeks later, notification arrived that their paper had been accepted for presentation at the conference. Furthermore, it was selected as one of only 5 papers to be published in the special edition of the Journal of Computational Mathematics. Professor Harrison, who rarely showed emotion, actually smiled when sharing the news with the team. "This is a significant achievement for all of us," he said, "and a testament to what can happen when we collaborate across different perspectives and backgrounds." The annual Faculty Honors Dinner at Stanford was a prestigious affair. Held in the Grand Memorial Hall, it brought together distinguished professors, promising students, and generous donors to celebrate academic excellence. White tablecloths and fine china adorned long tables, while soft classical music played in the background. For students, an invitation to this event was considered a significant honor. "Ah, Mr. Pichai, you made it," Professor Harrison called out, approaching with a glass of sparkling water in hand. "There are several people I'd like you to meet tonight." Sundar nodded politely, following the professor through the crowded room. He noticed that Harrison carried himself differently in this setting. More relaxed, almost friendly, a stark contrast to the intimidating figure he projected in the classroom. "Dean Williams, allow me to introduce Sundar Pichai, the extraordinary student I mentioned," Harrison said, stopping beside an older man with silver hair and a warm smile. "Professor Harrison has told me about your mathematical insights," the dean said, shaking Sundar's hand firmly. "Quite impressive for a master's student." "Thank you, sir," Sundar replied modestly. "I've been fortunate to work with Professor Harrison's research team." "Fortunate?" Harrison chuckled. "I think our department is the fortunate one. Mr. Pichai has helped push our algorithm research years ahead of schedule." As dinner began, Sundar found himself seated at a table with several department heads and a visiting professor from MIT. The conversation flowed around academic topics, recent publications, and university politics. Sundar spoke only when addressed directly, his natural humility preventing him from drawing attention to himself. During the main course, Professor Thomas Chen from the Computer Science Department joined their table, taking an empty seat beside Harrison. "Richard, I've been meaning to ask you about that brilliant paper you published last month," Chen said, leaning toward Harrison. "The approach to optimization algorithms was unlike anything I've seen from your group before." Harrison nodded, finishing a bite of his meal before responding. "That's largely thanks to Mr. Pichai here." He gestured toward Sundar. His mathematical intuition opened up entirely new possibilities. Professor Chen turned to study Sundar with newfound interest. "Pichai, that name sounds familiar. Are you from IIT by any chance?" "Yes, sir. IT Kharagpur," Sundar confirmed. Chen's eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Wait, Sundar Pichai from IIT Kharagpur, the one who broke records in the All India Mathematics Olympiad while still in high school?" The table fell silent as all eyes turned toward Sundar. "You were something of a legend in competitive mathematics circles," Chen continued. "I judged international competitions for years. Your solutions were always distinctive, elegant in ways that made other judges take notice." Harrison looked between Chen and Sundar, clearly surprised by this revelation. "You never mentioned your competitive mathematics background to me, Mr. Pichai." "It didn't seem relevant to our coursework, sir," Sundar replied simply. Chen laughed. "Not relevant? Richard, do you realize who you have in your class? This young man was offered scholarships from Cambridge, Oxford, and MIT before choosing IIT. His approach to the International Math Olympiad's hardest problem is still used as a teaching example." Harrison's expression shifted from surprise to understanding, then to something that looked almost like embarrassment as he recalled his early attempts to humiliate Sundar in class. "I had no idea," Harrison admitted quietly. "That's because he's too humble to mention it," Chen said, patting Sundar on the shoulder. "Some of the most brilliant minds have that quality. They let their work speak for itself." The conversation gradually shifted to other topics, but Harrison remained unusually quiet, occasionally glancing at Sundar with a new perspective. The professor who had tried to embarrass a foreign student now realized he had actually been challenging a mathematical prodigy. After dinner, as guests mingled over coffee and dessert, Harrison approached Sundar, who stood alone near a window. "Why didn't you tell me about your background that first day in class?" Harrison asked directly. "When I called you to the board." Sundar considered the question carefully. "What would that have accomplished, Professor? I wasn't there to prove my past achievements. I was there to learn." Harrison nodded slowly, a new respect evident in his eyes. "You taught me something important, Mr. Pichai. Perhaps more than I've taught you." As they stood together looking out at the campus lights, both men understood that a significant transformation had occurred, not just in their relationship, but in Harrison's approach to teaching and judging others. 10 years passed since that memorable evening at the faculty honors dinner. Stanford's campus had changed, new buildings had risen, old ones had been renovated, but the spirit of academic excellence remained the same. Professor Richard Harrison, now in his late 60s with fully white hair, still taught advanced calculus, though rumors of his upcoming retirement circulated through the department. On a bright spring afternoon, Harrison stood before a fresh group of eager graduate students. His teaching style had evolved over the years, still challenging but no longer intimidating. Students described him as tough but fair, demanding but supportive. Today, Harrison announced to his class, "I want to share a story about one of the most important lessons I learned as an educator." He leaned against his desk, looking more reflective than usual. "It's about assumptions, brilliance, and humility." The students exchanged curious glances. Professor Harrison rarely spoke about personal matters. "Years ago, a young man from India joined my class," Harrison began. "I'm embarrassed to admit that I made assumptions based on his quiet demeanor and accent. I even tried to humiliate him by calling him to solve a particularly difficult problem." The lecture hall was silent, students captivated by this unexpected confession from their normally reserved professor. What I didn't know was that this student had been a mathematics prodigy, with achievements I would only learn about months later. He solved the problem with an elegance that should have immediately signaled his exceptional talent. Harrison walked to the whiteboard and wrote an equation, the same one he had challenged Sundar to solve a decade earlier. This student went on to become one of Stanford's most distinguished alumni, though not in pure mathematics as I might have expected. Instead, he applied his brilliant analytical mind to technology, helping to shape how billions of people interact with information. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Professor, are you talking about Sundar Pichai?" Harrison nodded, a smile forming on his usually stern face. Indeed. The current CEO of Google, who recently oversaw one of the most significant advancements in artificial intelligence systems. And once upon a time, he was just a quiet student in the back row of this very classroom. The students whispered excitedly, many pulling out their phones to search for information about Pichai. "The reason I'm sharing this story," Harrison continued, "is not to claim any credit for Mr. Pichai's success. Quite the opposite. I want you to understand that brilliant minds come in all forms, from all backgrounds. True intelligence is often paired with humility. As educators and researchers, we must learn to recognize and nurture talent, not test it with unnecessary obstacles." After class, as students filed out of the room, a teaching assistant handed Harrison an envelope. "This was delivered for you earlier today, Professor." Harrison opened it to find an invitation to a special technology summit in Silicon Valley the following month. Attached was a handwritten note. Asterisk, Professor Harrison, asterisk. Asterisk, I hope you'll consider being our honored guest at this event focused on mathematics in modern computing. Your influence on my approach to problem solving continues to impact my work today. The lessons from your classroom, both mathematical and personal, have proven invaluable asterisk. Asterisk, with respect and gratitude, asterisk. Asterisk, Sundar asterisk. Harrison carefully placed the invitation in his briefcase. The journey from that first confrontational class to this moment represented everything he had come to value about education, not just the transmission of knowledge, but the mutual growth that occurs when minds connect across differences. Later that evening, Harrison sat in his office preparing for the next day's lecture. On his bookshelf stood a framed copy of the research paper he and Sundar had published together. Beside it was a more recent edition, a photograph from last year's alumni event showing Harrison and Pichai in conversation, both smiling with genuine warmth. The professor who had once tried to humiliate a foreign student now counted that day among his most important professional lessons. He had learned that true education flows in both directions, from teacher to student and back again. And sometimes, the most brilliant minds are found in the quietest corners of the classroom, waiting not for recognition, but for the opportunity to solve problems that matter. Harrison turned off his office light and closed the door, grateful for the student who had taught him to look beyond appearances and find the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary. It was a lesson he now passed on to every new class of bright young minds, ensuring that Sundar's impact extended far beyond algorithms and equations.